I would like to start this session on the substantive testing worksheet by first of all referring to the probe methodology. Looking at the slide, which should be familiar by now, dealing with the probe MMX process. This slide shows how you can address the risk of material misstatement by using any of the 6 processes or steps, being required procedures, significant risk responses, tests of controls, etc., etc. Now you can use the substantive test worksheet for a number of these sections. So it's not just a sampling worksheet. You can use it in the required procedures section for all those steps that say select all material items and do X, Y, Z. You can use 90.20 to basically replace your Excel worksheet or Excel spreadsheet that you would normally use. You'd rather use 90.20 to document your findings on the material items. When you get to extended test of details, well, there the audit procedures would say select all unusual items or select all individually significant items. Again, you can use 90.20 to document your findings on these sections or on these items. And then, of course, lastly, should you decide to do sampling, you can also use 90.20, your substantive testing worksheet, for your sample. If we move on to the caseware then, where do we get this? In caseware, towards the bottom under section 90, there I find the case view templates, and very specifically then the substantive testing worksheet under 90.20. Please note that the case view template documents have to be renumbered before you can use them. In the new version, we've even put a little warning in there for you. So should you start working on a document that still is marked as a template, and that is simple to identify or easy to know that it is still a template because it will have the number in the document name 90.20.30. whatever. So the moment that you've got a document that is still a template, you will get the message to say this document is a template, you can't use it. Please copy this document, change the properties of this document, and tell this document which section you are working with. Alright, so just how 90 means template, if you look at debtors, for instance, 3131, section 31 is your debtor section. So what we have is to do, we actually have to close the 90.20 document, we have to copy the document, and paste it under the section for trade receivables. In this case, for the example today, we're going to work in receivables, trade receivables. So copy that, paste it in trade receivables, and then move up where we go and change the properties for this document. So in the properties then, you will find, or you will see there, how I've already changed the properties of this document to now read 31.21. Remember, the last 2 numbers, doesn't matter what it is. Yes, they can't be duplicated, but the 31 before the full stop is what indicates to this document that it relates to trade receivables or debtors. Also, a very good habit to teach yourself is to change the identifiers for the first 4 digits or numbers to be exactly the same as your document number. In that way, should it be necessary to actually access this document from the uncompressed file, from the folder, you will be able to identify it very easily because you've changed the numbers to coincide with the document name. Right, moving on to the document itself then. In this document 31.21, which is now my substantive testing worksheet, I will see that automatically there's going to be 2 tabs. The first tab being my summary tab, which really is just my planning, my risk assessment, and also towards the bottom you're going to see my conclusion and my evaluation. The detailed test tab is almost like that Excel spreadsheet part. At the moment, if this document was still uncompleted, it would have been a blank sheet where I would have to put stuff in there. In this specific example, it's not blank because I've already completed it to a large extent. What we find in this document is that you have to indicate, as with any normal working paper, what you are doing and what you have considered. So we start by documenting our audit program step. We identify the balance, in this case, debtors. Through selecting the lead schedule, very easily, very simply, it automatically links the balance from my caseware file. I then move on to saying which assertions am I working with. For today's example, we're going to work with existence. I simply click on that little block there and it will open up only the considerations with regards to existence and occurrence. Moving on to the next little steps, really just documenting what will I be testing, what will I consider a misstatement, etc. G and H being my specific materiality considerations. Very specific then, specific materiality and items considered to be individually significant for debtors. When I get to the risk part then, that is where I now only work with the risk considerations around the assertions that I've selected. In this case, it was, of course, existence and occurrence. You will see there that that medium pulls through automatically. It picks it up from our audit plan and from our risk assessment that said, right, medium risk of material misstatement. This document also picks up my audit plan or my planned response. In this case then, I had planned to have significant risk responses as well as the required procedures. However, when I look at the expected assurance that I'm going to get, what assurance do I expect to get from the audit procedures that I'm going to be performing, and bearing in mind that I'm now looking at existence and occurrence only. For our example today, the significant risk response may have related to valuation or completeness or something other than existence and occurrence. So I don't complete anything in there. But when I get to required procedures, I say, okay, there I'm going to go do my work, and I expect to get high assurance from that. The answers in this section brings me to a result, and the result then being the risk factor. Now the factor at the moment you can see is 0.96. It can range between 0.7 and 3.3. So you can see we're going towards the lower end here. 0.96 is not far from 0.7. So we expect a rather smaller sample size. Up to this point, I may even choose not to do sampling. Even if I choose to only do my required procedures in this document, those material items, I could now move to the detailed test sheet and go and complete this document. So let's go there and have a look. In the detailed test section, if I just close the sample for now, if we hadn't selected the sample yet, I would go and identify every material debtor. In other words, every debtor greater than my specific materiality, in this case, 36,000 Rand. Every one of those debtors would then be listed here in the material section. Now, I've already identified one there, that was Mr. Material Debtor, and he had a balance specifically of 40,000 Rand. If I'm going to go and audit this for variable testing, which is what we normally do, I would have selected in that little block there, I would have ticked it and said, yes, we're doing variable testing. For substantive work, we normally want to prove the balance, and for that, we do variable testing. So then I get this column for audited book value. Going to test that material debtor, and I find that the balance owing to us or to our client is rather only 39,000 Rand, with the error of 1,000 Rand. If I have more than one material debtor, I simply have to click on that first line and right click and say insert row, and I can insert a number of rows there. So that's quite easy, and I simply go and insert a row, and I can add extra debtors that are material or individually significant. Secondly, I can also move on to those extended test of detail sections where I also select my unusual items. And here we've got one debtor called Mr. Unusual Debtor. A balance of only 5,000 Rand, which is not that material, but he was maybe a foreign debtor or a new debtor or some other one that we specifically wanted to go and test because he was unusual for some other reason. Alright, so after doing this work, then it's no longer necessary for me to be in the detail test section. I can move on to the sample section. Going back to the summary tab. If I want to do sampling, I would then move on to this sample design section, which then asks me, right, how big is your population and how many of these items have still not been tested specifically? Our material items, unusual items, individually significant items. So then I go and tell this document, right, I've got 100 debtors, I've numbered them from 1 to 100. The total population, therefore, is 100 items that it calculates itself, and it also gives me the value of the total population. Number D is the 40,000 Rand for Mr. Material Debtor that also pulls through from our detail test tab, as well as number E, which was my unusual item, bringing me to line F that says the remaining balance, therefore, is 370,000, and that's only 98 debtors. It calculates the sample size, bearing in mind my risk factor, as well as the remaining balance. And then I've got the option to choose how I want to select my sample. You could do a random selection, systematic selection, monitor unit sampling, and of course, haphazard. Just one warning, monitor unit sampling you can normally only do for overstatement testing. Personally, I'm rather fond of systematic selection because it's simple and it is still unbiased. In our example then, I've selected the systematic selection. It tells me the starting point is somewhere between 1 and 10 items, and I've just chosen number 5 to be my random starting point. The moment I've clicked on that 5 to say that's my random starting point and I go to my details testing, I will find that my sample has automatically been selected. My 10 items in my sample and every one of those numbers of debtors that I have to simply go and find in my age analysis. For ease of reference, I've numbered the debtors or given their names A to J, but we can also refer to the numbers, so don't worry about them too much. What I'm going to do now is go and identify each of these debtors in my age analysis, and I put in the client book value as they are on the age analysis. I audit them, and I identify the audited book value or the right value as we have audited it to indicate the third column, the misstatement in the accounts. You will see here that all the balances are much smaller than our specific materiality because all the material items have already been selected. In this case, I've got 3 errors. One 5 Rand, another 5 Rand, and then that 50 Rand. Now, should it happen that debtor C, our third selection, was an isolated incident and I had investigated it and I've got audit evidence to show that it is an isolated incident, I can actually exclude that 5 Rand error from my extrapolation. I would simply click on the exclude button, the value would disappear from my misstatement column and it would not be taken into account when I extrapolate the error. Moving back to my summary then, the evaluation part, where I then go and say, right, what errors did I get? And I start off with the 3 categories of errors. Firstly, the category for material items. There I had a 1,000 Rand error, which note would not be extrapolated. With the unusual items, I did not have any errors, so therefore just a 0 amount. And then the extrapolated error from the sample being the 412 Rand. Note, excluding that 5 Rand. The total actual errors then is 1412. The recorded book value was the 416 per the client's records, and the correct value, which should be in the accounts, is then 414, almost 415,000. Now, the difference here is less than the clearly trivial amount of 1.5. So the difference would simply be left here, and we say this is not considered material, and therefore we don't have to do anything. Remember, any differences less than clearly trivial amount can simply be left on the working paper and does not need to go anywhere. As a last thought, I want to just indicate or take your attention, your focus to the coverage column. The coverage column shows more or less how much work you have done, just to give you an indication. Some people do focus on coverage. Now in this case you will see that you've only tested 21% of the total population. In other words, 21% of your total debtors balance. But you've got enough audit evidence to conclude on the whole book value, on the total of the 400,000 rand. So that could then also help you to understand that if you do select in this way, you could be testing less items as opposed to aiming for a 80% coverage or anything like that. The last point that you then have to address in the working paper is, of course, the conclusion, where I've simply just said total error is less than clearly trivial and therefore not considered material.